Hello and welcome to Coffee with HR Pro. I am your host, Ash, and today we are delving into fascinating world of labor relations and arbitration in negotiations. This topic plays a crucial role and critical role in shaping fair and effective workplace, and we have a perfect guest to guide us through it all. Joining me is Lisa Mastrobuono, a seasoned expert in labor relations and a qualified arbitrator. Lisa is a founder and president of Acuity Strategic Solutions, where she consult and train employer, union, and labor relations, negotiations, and stakeholder engagement, mediation, and much more. With 2 decades of experience, Lisa has seen it all, from complex arbitration to collective bargaining, strategies that drive collaboration. Today, we will be exploring Lisa's journey, her insight into labor relations, and how arbitration and negotiations can build a strong workplaces. Whether you are in HR or LR or a union rep, or just curious about what happens behind the scene in labor relations, the conversation will be packed with insight and actionable advice. So grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's dive in. Uh, Before we starting a podcast, I just want to clarify that this podcast is separate from my work life. So it is my desire to zero cost to HR learners and professionals who would like to learn from these podcast episodes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to your podcast, Ash. I really appreciate it.
Yep. So let's start with the question. Can you please tell us a bit about your journey into labor relations and how it led you become a qualified arbitrator?
Well, it's a little bit of a tangled journey, I guess. So I started off as a certified elementary teacher working at the Toronto District School Board. Teachers and education workers in Ontario are very lucky. They have very active unions that negotiate and enforce collective agreements on their behalf. And those unions also provide a lot of training, coaching, and mentoring to members who are interested in becoming more involved in labor relations and in negotiations. I participated in a lot of training through my union at the time, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. It's also called ETFO. And ETFO represents about 84,000 teachers and education workers who work from kindergarten through to grade 8 in Ontario public schools. So I put that training to good use when I became a member of my local union's collective bargaining committee in 2000, and then I became chair of the committee a little bit after that. I loved working in negotiation. I loved doing negotiations. So I stepped up and I was eventually elected to the local union leadership in the Toronto chapter of ETFO in 2005. And that meant that I was seconded from the classroom, outside of the classroom, to work on labor relations, employment relations, grievance arbitration, and negotiations on behalf of the 11,000 elementary teachers who work at TDSB. So I'd have daily contact with management in my union side role on any issue you could possibly imagine: performance appraisal, accommodations, workplace conflicts, pay issues, health and safety concerns, collective agreement issues, and so on. So locally, I was also the grievance officer and a negotiator as well. In 2011, I was hired by ETFO, the provincial office, to work as a collective bargaining staff officer and bargaining communications lead in their collective bargaining department. In that department, I helped ETFO's local labor relations practitioners around the province negotiate collective agreements with their school boards, as well as showed them how to effectively enforce those agreements between bargaining rounds and to work constructively with employers and professionally with employers on issues as they arose in the area of employment relations, labor relations, and teacher professional issues. There was a lot of coaching, modeling, and mentoring in the work that I did, and I absolutely loved it. My role at ETFO also involved creating and providing formal training sessions for both classroom educators and local union leaders on and labor relations practitioners on many aspects of labor relations, including grievance arbitration, how to handle grievances effectively, effective negotiation skills, mediation techniques, understanding how to read, interpret, and craft collective agreement language, preparing for bargaining, managing negotiation team dynamics. That can be a really contentious thing. If you've ever done it before, you know. And also how to conduct effective communication campaigns to support your bargaining goals. Since I'm a teacher by training, this training was a aspect of my job, was a really fun part of my job. In 2018, after being involved in hundreds of grievance arbitration processes in my role at ETFO, I decided to take some additional training. And I became designated by the Alternative Dispute Resolution Institute of Canada as a qualified arbitrator. In 2021, I was promoted to the position of Deputy General Secretary, which is equivalent to an Associate Executive Director position at ETFO. The DGS role was focused on providing leadership for labor relations, negotiations, and the interpretation, application, and enforcement of 87 ETFO and 3 ETFO staff union collective agreements, so about 91 collective agreements. Or 90 collective agreements. In that role, I oversaw about 30 staff members in the collective bargaining, professional relations, health and safety, information technology, records management, and member records departments. I was also ETFO's lead negotiator during provincial negotiations with the Government of Ontario for the renewal of central agreements. And because I was management at ETFO at the time, I was ATFO's lead negotiator during the renegotiation of collective agreements with ATFO staff unions. So I've had a very interesting career, I think, and I've really enjoyed my career so far.
Yeah, I can imagine from teacher to local union rep and then to become a deputy secretary. And now I think you have a equity strategic solutions. So, what inspired you to start equity strategic solutions, and what kind of work does your organization focus on?
Yes. So I left ETFO after having a 20 plus really wonderful and fulfilling years of working in labor relations and in the senior management. I absolutely loved the job. My last 3 years at ETFO as Deputy General Secretary involved a really interesting dynamic, which was on the union side, I was representing 84,000 ETFO members at provincial bargaining tables across from the government, as well as coaching, mentoring, training, and productively working with the unionized executive, managerial, and support staff within ETFO. So that was my management side job. So I was wearing two hats at the same time, both management side and union side. I learned quite a bit about the perspective of each side in labor relations during that time. And over the past 20 years or so of being involved in many, many negotiations for collective agreements, being a part of several hundred arbitrations and grievance processes, and doing an awful lot of training, hundreds of training sessions on labor relations fundamentals. I developed a unique set of skills that I thought others, both union side and management side, might benefit from. So a few months ago, I decided to start Acuity Strategic Solutions, which provides both employers and unions with advice and training on every aspect of labor relations, including negotiations, workplace investigations, mediation, and arbitration. I also conduct board and executive strategic planning and training sessions for companies, not-for-profits, charitable institutions, and unions. And I also act as an electoral officer during elections and voting processes conducted by boards and unions, because sometimes those can be very contentious processes too, and an outside neutral party can often help diffuse the conflict. So yes, I'm absolutely loving building this business and growing it from my roots as a teacher, a labor relations practitioner, manager, and coach.
Yeah, so basically, passion for profession drives you to basically start equity strategic solutions. Oh,
Yes,
yeah,
that's a good way of putting it. Yes.
yeah, yeah. And let's jump into labor relations and arbitration. So we know that labor relations is more crucial, and nowadays it's a more a very strategic in a way that like from the beginning to end. So how would you define the role of arbitration in labor relations and why it is crucial? And if you
So
have
that
any examples, like challenging examples, you can share with us.
Okay, that. I think that's a really good question. A very good question. I'm glad you asked it. I think that for some who aren't so familiar with labor relations or collective bargaining or collective agreements, the concept of arbitration can seem very adversarial or aggressive, very much like the concept of taking somebody to court or suing them, or, so it's
Yeah.
very, win-lose situation. But really, nothing can be further from the truth about the arbitration process in labor relations, provided it's approached properly and with an understanding of its purpose. So, arbitration in labor relations is simply a tool. It's not a hammer, it's not an axe, it's a tool for resolving disputes between employers and employees through their union, through the representative union, as opposed to leaving those disputes unresolved and festering, causing damage to relationships and potentially long conflicts or strikes. So most collective agreements in Ontario would have a grievance arbitration process defined within it. I don't think I've ever seen one that doesn't have one in it. But if it's not for some reason, if people decide, well, we don't need an arbitration process in there, it's actually outlined, it's actually in the Labor Relations Act in Ontario. It articulates a default arbitration process that employers and unions must use to settle a dispute arising out of the terms of a negotiated settlement that results in a collective agreement. So even if you decide you don't want an arbitration process, the
Yeah.
legislation
It,
provides for you having one because it's an important and constructive part of your collective agreement. In labor relations, arbitration is typically initiated when a dispute arises about the interpretation of a collective agreement provision that can't be resolved through discussion or simply through the give and take of a grievance conversation. Um, the collective agreement would detail that arbitration process, how it would actually work, which would normally take place after the grievance steps in the agreement are exhausted. Arbitration involves both parties selecting an arbitrator or a panel of arbitrators. You see that less often in collective agreements, the
yes.
panel of arbitrators. And because there's a cost to it, to both the union and the employer when you have a panel. Um, but let's just say that it's an arbitrator. So the arbitrator hears the arguments of the employer and the union, reviews the evidence presented by both sides in either a formal and informal setting. And after some deliberation, the arbitrator would issue a decision known as an award, an arbitration award, which is legally binding and enforceable. It's that part of the collective agreement, the arbitration process, is crucial to labor relations because it provides a very structured and extremely efficient means of resolving disputes, which can prevent and disputes prevent can cause work stoppages and destroy productivity, morale, and relationships. And arbitration preserves that. Arbitration takes the conflict out of the workplace and it puts it in the resolution. It puts the resolution of that conflict in the hands of a skilled, neutral third party, which is the arbitrator. The process's neutrality promotes a sense of fairness in the workplace. And by offering a binding resolution, arbitration can help to clarify the sometimes ambiguous language in a collective agreement, while at the same time fostering a stable work environment. And sometimes it's a lot easier. It can be very difficult to achieve compromise on politically contentious issues or organizationally contentious issues and take on that responsibility yourself. You can put that in the hands of an arbitrator, and the arbitrator will do what needs to be done for the organization and the union. And it's a very constructive process that has resulted in, you know, fewer wildcat strikes, less toxicity in the
Yeah.
workplace. So it's a very positive process. Not at all like suing somebody. It's really just another dispute resolution mechanism, and that's how it should be seen.
Yeah. So yeah, as you mentioned, like we have seen many collective agreements who have not correct language or ambiguity in the language, and sometimes I have seen many collective agreements which doesn't have any stipulated expedited arbitration process. So what are the common mistakes employer and unions make during the administration of their collective agreement that leads to arbitration?
Well, some of the common mistakes that both employers and unions make when they're administering collective agreements, it's fairly consistent, I think, based on my experience. It's things like, and I think I'm going to be saying this a lot, it's going to become very repetitive, unfortunately, but poor communication is one thing that is a problem that makes the administration of collective agreements problematic. So failing to maintain clear and open lines of communication, that can lead to misunderstandings about contract terms, and that results in disputes that can escalate into arbitration. In addition, miscommunication can stem from, as you said, the unclear language in the collective agreement, leading to different interpretations by employers and union members, which is why it's important. And this is the other thing I'm going to say quite a lot is having your bargaining team trained in drafting collective agreement language is an absolute must. It's not something that comes easily to people or naturally. It's something that you learn and you grow over time. It's a skill you grow over time. So it's also to incorporate, and this is my as part of communication. I think this is really very important. Um, it's important to incorporate regular face-to-face or virtual meetings or telephone updates between the employer and the union, because that can really help to clarify expectations and responsibilities as well as clear up misunderstandings. I know the 21st century is not, many people are not predisposed in the workplace to talking to each other. A text is fast, an email is efficient, but those forms of communication can be easily misunderstood, and they can lead to escalating conflict and misunderstandings that's very hard to step back from. So I always find that when I need to explain something, when I have a question, when I'm seeking understanding, speaking to the person on the other side, if we want to call it the other side, is always the best option. I've seen that many times when just a simple phone call clarifies so much.
Absolutely.
The other thing I would say is common mistakes is inconsistent application of policies and collective agreement terms can cause issues that may lead the parties to consider arbitration as a step that maybe is unnecessary at sometimes. So when employers or unions apply or enforce policies or collective agreement language inconsistently, it creates grievances, unnecessary grievances, often. So this inconsistency can stem from a lack of training or awareness of the collective agreement's provisions. For instance, if one employee is disciplined for a specific behavior and another is not, it can lead to claims of unfair treatment.
Absolutely.
If one union rep chooses to enforce a provision of the collective agreement and another in the same local does not, that creates potential problems as well. So consistent application of policies of collective agreement language is very important. I think the third thing I want to add is lack of experience combined with insufficient training. That can escalate issues when it's not necessary to do so. So failing to, you might have an HR director who understands the collective agreement really well, but failing to adequately train frontline managers, supervisors, and so on. Or you might have a local president, union president, who understands it very well. But, they work in an office with 10 other people, not training those union representatives on the details of the collective agreement. Those situations can lead to unintentional violations of the collective agreement, misunderstandings of what the language means and what it doesn't mean. So I'm a big proponent of regular training sessions for employer and union reps to ensure that all the parties are up to date on their rights and responsibilities, that they know what they are, that they understand what the collective agreement means, and that they know how to interpret it. I think that's important. So I would say those three things: communication, consistent application, and good training of anybody who's going to be working with that collective agreement, applying it and discussing it with the other side is incredible. It's very important.
Okay, so yeah, it's a very good and very informative thing. You take it down to very three specific communication, training, and collective
Application.
application of the collective agreement.
Yeah.
So, with your extensive experience in collective bargaining, what strategy or strategies you recommend for achieving successful agreements?
Okay. So uh, it's negotiating a successful collective agreement. Um, the strategies are the same on the union side and management side.
Yes.
It really is the same. It requires a blend of strategies that focus on several things: collaborating, transparency, communication, understanding mutual benefit, and being a principled negotiator rather than a positional negotiator. Those are two very different things. So I would say that some of the effective strategies can include doing your homework by thoroughly preparing and researching before you reach the negotiation table. Don't try to wing it. That is not going to work, even for the most experienced person. So this means understanding the interests and needs of both parties, gathering data on industry standards, understanding how economic conditions factor into the collective agreement, understanding how the specific concerns in your workplace and within your workforce factor into the collective agreement. It's important. It's very negotiations is about relationships, whether it's in labor relations or employment relations, whether it's about a collective agreement or it's just a simple memorandum of understanding that you're doing. It's all about relationships. So make an effort. From my perspective, everybody on both sides needs to make an effort to build amicable and professional relationships between the parties, not just at the bargaining table, but well before the start of bargaining. People don't forget if you're, dismissive of them, throughout the year, and then you're at the bargaining table and you've got a big smile on your face. The past matters, history matters. So you need to establish trust and open lines of communication between management and union representatives all year round, in bargaining and without bargaining. Strong relations, going into bargaining with strong relationships facilitates smoother negotiations. Um, it's really important that you head into bargaining with a prioritized set of goals. Rather than coming to the table, and I've seen this many times, you come to the table with a 100-page preliminary submission that includes every demand under the sun. Uh, Rather than doing that, because you are never going to get bargaining and eventually you are going to have to prioritize, it's important at the start or near the start to identify which issues are most important to your side, but also to anticipate the issues that are most important to the other side, because this is all about strategy. It's like a chess game, and you need to understand what the advanced moves are going to be on both sides. So I try to focus on common interests. I try to focus on areas where concessions can be made, which is not, very often there are things that are not so important to one side, very important to another, and they can be used as part of the bargaining process and as leverage. I think it's important to be, as I said, not positional, to be flexible and open to compromise. That doesn't mean bowling over and agreeing to every demand. That's not what that means. You're going to go into bargaining with a set of principles of what's important to you and lines in the sand. But within that, around those lines in the sand is a lot of opportunity to negotiate. You need to have a bit of a willingness to adapt, to find some middle ground in places, and recognize that some give and take is really essential to achieve a successful agreement in most cases. One thing that's very boring But it's very, very important. People don't like it. You have to document everything. You have to keep
Absolutely.
pristine records during the bargaining process. It's a critical piece. Documents can get lost, passes can get forgotten, timelines get confused, and you don't want that to happen. And that's why having a very well-trained team with clearly defined roles. They understand their roles and what they need to do, like the note taker, the pass keeper, the file manager. Those roles are incredibly important. People think that they're dull job. They're absolutely critical. Keep detailed records of discussions and agreed upon items as soon as they arise. That is absolutely key. It helps avoid misunderstandings and provides clarity for all parties involved. The other thing that some people are reluctant to do, but it's important, is seek help, seek mediation if necessary. Negotiations stall sometimes. That's natural, and it's not admitting defeat for the parties to consider involving a neutral third party to mediate to help facilitate a resolution for part of the bargaining or maybe for all of the bargaining process. It's quite common to need that kind of support to overcome bargaining impasses. And the Labor Relations Act in Ontario actually provides a process that the parties can rely upon to seek that help. And it's at no cost to the parties. So it's there. There's no reason not to seek it out if both parties want it. It's a very, very accepted part of the process. And sometimes you will stall, and sometimes you need somebody to get you through that barrier that's keeping you from an agreement. And I think the final thing that I want to add is uh, don't just think about bargaining during the bargaining time. There's an after bargaining process that's important, and you need to communicate that agreement when it's reached and after it's reached. So once you've got an agreement, ensure that it is clearly communicated to all the stakeholders when you're within your organization. Or the stakeholders in your union to foster understanding and compliance. And this often involves training sessions so that everybody is on the same page about what changes to the agreement mean based on the intentions of the parties at the bargaining table. So that agreement is a living document, and it needs people to understand the document. And sometimes that means training after that bargaining is done. So I think for me, those are the components of achieving a successful collective agreement in bargaining and afterwards.
Too many informations. So, uh, based on your experience and uh, once someone's employers or like collective agreement expires, so I think we have a set in Ontario Labor Relations Act that you have to before 90 days before you need to give a notice of bargain. And so, uh, can you see what are the trends you have observed in collective bargaining over last few years, especially in Ontario? Like I can see
Yeah.
kind of a narcotic effect or dependency effect, basically on arbitration or other sort of alternative dispute resolutions.
Yes. So there have been some really interesting trends in collective bargaining over the last few years in Ontario, and I think they've been beyond Ontario as well. The pandemic has really changed a lot of things in a lot of areas and shifted things. So in recent years, I think collective bargaining in Ontario has seen a few notable trends. So first, there has been a rise in strikes and job actions. And that's reflecting the increased dissatisfaction among workers regarding wages, job security, and working conditions. Now, strike action is still unusual in Ontario. The overwhelming number of negotiations that occur for collective agreements do not result in job action or lockouts. But the pandemic and the economic conditions that accompanied it, namely a significant inflationary period, has resulted in a little bit of an uptake in labor unrest. And secondly, I think there has been, in collective bargaining, a greater emphasis on equity and inclusivity in negotiations. with unions advocating for better representation and support for marginalized groups within the workforce. And I would say that most employers in Canada are actually quite sympathetic to these types of proposals and sometimes themselves include changes to collective agreement language based on the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So that is a positive development observed over the last few years, particularly. I think I'll just leave with a one third and last one. Another direct impact of the pandemic on collective bargaining has been a big shift to the focus of bargaining towards issues like remote work policies. Big, big issue, very
Absolutely.
big topic now, and one that was not seen as a big priority 10 or 15 years ago. It might have been on the list for employees, for workers, but it was down on the list. And if they couldn't get anything, well, no, not an issue. Now it is at the top of the list and it is hard fought. As you know, and it is a big issue for unions and workers and employers. Some other issues as well, health and safety issues, mental health supports, those issues are important too. But I would say remote work has really catapulted up there as one of those top bargaining issues that wasn't there perhaps so much 10 years ago.
Yeah, I guess remote work, telework, or um,
Yes.
uh, health and
Flexible work
yeah,
arrangements, that kind of thing. Yes.
it's a growing concern now. Uh, we already talked about arbitration. So arbitration is only not only just other sort of resolution mechanism in labor relations. So let's talk about mediation and dispute resolution. So can you uh, define in your words what is mediation and how it differs from uh, arbitration when uh, and when should organization choose over others?
Yes. So that's a good question. So mediation and arbitration really they are both forms of alternative dispute resolution. They are, but they do differ in their processes and their outcomes. That's for sure. So mediation involves a neutral third party, a mediator, who facilitates discussions between conflicting parties to help them reach a mutually agreeable solution. So the mediator doesn't impose a decision. What they do is they guide the parties to communicate and negotiate effectively. And it's a collaborative process. It often preserves relationships. And it also, very interestingly, allows for some really out of the box and creative solutions that can be tailored to the party's needs. In contrast, arbitration is a more formal process where a neutral third party, an arbitrator, this time not a mediator, hears the arguments and the evidence from both sides and then makes a binding decision. They make the decision as opposed to helping the parties reach a decision collectively. The arbitrator's decision is typically final. And it's enforceable. And there are very limited grounds for appealing an arbitrator's decision. Courts really don't like to look at arbitrators' decisions very much. It's got to be completely wonky and very, very off base before the courts will even look at them and accept an appeal. It happens, but not very often. So mediation and arbitration each have unique benefits and considerations for organizations who are considering them. In mediation, the primary advantage is that it fosters a collaborative environment, and it can create, as I said, can create a customized solution to a specific problem. The two heads working together, something they maybe never would have thought about on their own. And additionally, mediation is often quicker and it's less expensive than formal arbitration. So those are big pluses. On the other hand, arbitration provides a more structured setting where the parties, you know, where another person is reaching the decision. And this can be advantageous when you want a clear, definitive resolution to something, or where the parties are so far apart that it's impossible to achieve a resolution through mediation. Or, I think I mentioned this before, where it's very politically difficult for one or the other of the parties to take ownership of a compromise position because of institutional realities or union realities, that kind of thing. Sometimes it's just easier to lay the decision at the feet of an arbitrator and have the arbitrator to decide. So, really, a number of factors go into deciding whether, to mediate versus arbitrate. It's how far the parties are, the nature of the relationships between the parties. Do they have a mediation mindset? If someone
Mhm.
doesn't have a mediation mindset, then it becomes a big waste of time to go into mediation. And the nature of the issue and dispute. So it's very case specific, and there's really no cut and dry solution to this. Sometimes it helps for organizations to get some outside advice to clarify their viable options for the employee, either for the employer or the union. Sometimes they need somebody from the outside to say, you know what, you just looking at the landscape, this might be the best way for you folks to proceed. So it's very case specific.
Yeah. Yep. Uh, so my next question would be, uh, can you share any tips for fostering collaboration between employer and unions during very argumentative negotiations?
So great question. And this is sort of an ongoing process that both parties have to be involved in, fostering collaboration. It's not just during contentious negotiations. As I said, that collaboration, that relationship needs to happen before and after and during. It's not something you turn on like a tap and then turn off. Unfortunately, human relationships don't work that way, and negotiations is ultimately about human relationships. So I would say that fostering collaboration between employers and unions during very difficult negotiations, and I have been part of those kinds of negotiations on both the union side and the management side, um, is difficult, but it's absolutely essential for achieving mutually beneficial outcomes. So how do you do that? First off, even when it's very difficult to do so, you keep the lines of communication open, always.
Absolutely.
Try and establish channels for dialogue where both parties can express their concerns and needs. And this is going to build trust. It's going to build understanding. Bargaining does have ebbs and flows. People need to understand that, where you may meet at the table for weeks and weeks and seem to get nothing done. And then the dam breaks and you're able to negotiate things very quickly. That's not unusual. It's to be expected. It's normal, as a matter of fact. I've rarely experienced a bargaining scenario where it doesn't work that way, actually. Don't let frustration for those times of impasse shut down your lines of communication. Those are the times when you actually want to ensure that both sides are connected to one another. And I think what you also want to do is a couple of other things. Try to identify some common objectives, shared goals, values, and principles that both sides are invested in. As a teacher, I was working with school board officials who were principals and superintendents. And our commonalities were that we were educators and that we cared about the kids and that we cared about school environments. And so there's always commonalities in the workplace. You just need to find them, and common principles and common values. You just need to work to find those things a little bit sometimes. If you focus on those shared interests and values, that can really help reduce adversarial attitudes. The other side becomes human, and it's easier to work with each side when each side recognizes their humanity. Um, Engage in active listening. Active listening is incredibly important. I'm a big talker. Active listening is hard for me. I'm always talking. That's not good. During challenging times at the bargaining table, employing active listening ensures that each side feels heard and valued. That can mitigate misunderstandings. It promotes empathy and can result in breakthroughs in bargaining. So talk less, listen more. I need to follow my own advice. I often have that written down in front of me. Talk less, listen more. And then also consider using a neutral third party to facilitate discussions. So a mediator can be really, really helpful during contentious negotiations. Often use them. It's not a failure. It's a recognition that you just need some extra help to get you through a certain part of the bargaining process. And a skilled mediator can do that. The Ministry of Labor can appoint one, and it is no cost to both parties. So at the very least, I've had situations where the mediator has not been helpful, but you've tried it. It's worth a try. It's cost nothing but a little bit of time. So I would say those are probably my tips for uh, uh, facing contentious negotiations and trying to foster collaboration during those times.
Yep. And you mentioned in our earlier conversation that right now remote work and mental health is growing nowadays. So, what are the uh, challenges do you see emerging in labor relations in next decade?
Hmm. Um, so I see in the next decade, this is going to be, these are interesting times. Um, they're interesting times internationally, in Canada, and they're interesting times in labor relations. So I see in the next decade, probably labor relations practitioners are going to be facing several challenges, including dealing with the rise of remote and gig work, technology and automation changes, the increasing focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which we welcome in Canada, by the way, and changes in how we work that will require more frequent retraining and reskilling. Those are really important key things that we're going to see that unions and employers are going to have to face. So one change that I'm particularly fascinated by as a negotiator and mediator is the increasing incorporation of artificial intelligence, AI, into the workplace, but also into negotiations and mediations. Um, it's not commonplace yet, but the rise of tools like Chat GPT and OpenAI and even DeepSeek, I just found out about DeepSeek
Yes.
like a month ago or something, is most certainly going to affect the world of negotiations and conflict resolution at some point. Right now, AI is, I know there are people using AI in mediations. AI right now, as it's conceived or as it's structured, is really not equipped to help the parties deal with the emotional byproducts that arise from contentious negotiations and mediations. There's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of humanity in bargaining and negotiations. And that is where the expertise of a human mediator lies, to diffuse, to deflect, to offer constructive options, to read body language, to know when people have had enough and they need a little break, and to offer some constructive options that lift parties out of deadlocks. But AI actually can be an effective tool that can augment the human mediator's skills. When disputes involve cost analyses, for example, or evaluating large amounts of data, AI can review and summarize that information very quickly for the mediator, or the negotiator, who can then use the information to inform their discussions in the parties. And I have to say that I have, my most recent negotiations used Chat GPT to not to write my bargaining positions or whatever, but basically to do exactly what I just said, which was to find complex data and summarize it so that I could think about it and present it at the table in a way that supported my positions at the table. So I think as AI becomes more sophisticated, it's possible it's going to take a more central role in developing negotiation strategies, handling mediations, and even being used at the bargaining table. So the next 5 or 10 years is going to be very interesting to watch that particular development, the use of AI in labor relations and in mediations and in negotiations. So I'm looking forward to the next 5 or 10 years and seeing how that evolves.
Absolutely. I think AI is one of the top topics in labor relations or HR professionals. In how can HR or labor relations professional prepare for future where remote work and technology increasingly shape workplaces?
Yep. So remote work, and recently the last few months, I think we've seen has become something of a lightning rod. As we see leadership in some large organizations, particularly in the US, we're seeing that deliver very hard line statements about expecting employees to be in the office 5 days a week if they want to keep their jobs and so on. There's a dichotomy, I think, between HR professionals who are really trying to recruit the best and the brightest people who do expect to work remotely at least part of the time, and this new hardening among other elements in the organization against remote work. At the same time, after the experience of the pandemic, when it seemed like people were getting their work done and getting the results that they achieved, but there was an unintended consequence for workers positive of actually feeling some work-life balance in their lives. So you now have unions on behalf of members making the ability to access remote work a big priority in negotiations. So we saw that issue unfold in recent very difficult negotiations in Canada between PSAC, PIPSIC, and the federal government, for example. And HR leaders are really caught in the middle between, from my perspective, senior staff that they're beholden to who want 100% in the office work and their staff in the work. And then there are, unions who are hearing from their members that they value remote work and, often above bread and butter issues like pay. And they want to make it a priority. So it's going to be a very challenging time for those in HR. But they can prepare, I think they can prepare for a future shaped by remote work and technology by doing a couple of things. So first off, start collecting data. It's HR personnel who are going to be relying on the data that either proves or disproves the effectiveness of remote work. That data is going to be really important as you engage with both your own stakeholders within your organization and in negotiations with unions to establish what's right, what's the right fit for your workplace. If you're in an environment where remote work is a feature, and I hope most people are because I think it's a very positive development in the workplace personally, then it's important to build a culture that emphasizes trust, but also accountability, enabling employees to work independently while feeling supported, but also having mechanisms in place to ensure that the work is getting done. Because nothing defeats those people who are really promoting remote options more than lack of productivity on that part. So you really have to watch that. And I think that maybe we have to kind of think of, there's a lot of positives to remote work, but one of the negatives that we hear about when it's discussed is that it leads to alienation and a sense of aloneness that's not conducive to employee mental health. And that's a big issue nowadays. So when implementing wellness programs and office procedures and practices, I would say that HR professionals shouldn't forget to tailor their programs and procedures to remote workers in a way that focuses on mental health, maximizes social connection, and encourages engagement within the organization. So I think that those would be some of the tips that I would share with HR professionals who I feel very sorry for right now and are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, and are trying to do the best for their organizations and satisfy many competing interests.
Yeah, absolutely. Nowadays, raising of AI, less human touch, and people are uh, disconnect with the emotions and more like data, data, data. So, uh,
Yes.
and also we have immigrants in Canada, and also we have a Gen Z, Gen Alpha, not Gen Alpha, but Gen Z.
Yes.
So, what impact do you think a generational shift in workforce will have on labor relations?
Oh, I think it's been having a shift on labor relations, and it's going to continue to have a shift. There's no doubt that generational shifts in the workplace are going to impact how employers work and how unions approach workplace issues. So younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs, they have different values and expectations. They tend to prioritize work-life balance, social justice, inclusivity, and being more actively centered within the decision making. Even if maybe have only been with the organization for a few months, they want to be at the center of the decision making. That's a big change. So these shifts may lead to changes in workplace demands and negotiation topics faced by both employers and unions. Younger members of the workforce in general, they also have an increased awareness and emphasis on diversity and equity. That's very important to them. And that emphasis can lead to more active discussions at staff meetings, public discussions at staff meetings, at water cooler meetings, union meetings around representation, and policies or strategies that support marginalized groups within the workforce in a very public way that wasn't necessarily occurring 10 years ago. And then we're back again to remote work. Younger people are in particular, all of us are, all of us are, but younger people in particular are seeking flexibility in work arrangements. And as remote work becomes more accepted, labor relation practitioners are going to have to address those new challenges around flexibility, productivity, employment engagement. Younger people will tend to vote with their feet and leave.
Yes.
And that is, you know, if the conditions aren't right for them, they're not going to buckle down and say, oh, you know, in 5 years it might change and I'm going to stay. They tend to leave, and they are, you know, and that is there's your succession planning going right out the window. So it's a very different mindset that millennials and in particular Gen Zs have. And it's something that both unions and employers are facing now and are going to need to adjust and accommodate to.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we are ending with podcast. So, is there a memorable experience or lessons in your career or in labor relations or in arbitrations that stand out as a particularly very impactful?
Yes. Yes, I think my first experience negotiating a collective agreement stands out. There's a sense among some that great negotiators are born, or that they need to be outgoing extroverts, or that they need to be hard bargainers, or they need to be the loudest voice in the room. So I remember our chief negotiator at the time was an introvert and very quiet, but she used that aspect of her personality to remain very calm and unmoved in the face of a highly antagonistic person on the other side of the table. That particular person would bluster, make loud pronouncements about being aggrieved and feeling abused, which she never responded to. She was unfazed. Instead, she turned his bluster into an active listening exercise. She stayed firmly on track. She stuck with the issues, and she stuck with our principled bargaining positions. And when it became obvious that she was not going to be put off her game by the aggressiveness of his tone, his positional behavior, and his threats, the tone of negotiations changed. It took a little while, but it changed and things became more productive. And the lesson that it taught me is that the loudest voice at the negotiations table is not necessarily the person that gets their own way or the best negotiator. How you react or not react to bluster and bluff and threats is incredibly important. So you need to be prepared. She taught me you need to be prepared. You need to know the issues. You need to understand your priorities. You need to stand your ground, seek commonalities, and be incredibly focused. So that's for me more often from what I've seen in my career, that's more often than not the winning combination to successful experience in any negotiation. So rather than being born a negotiator or being an extroverted negotiator, it's those things that often win the day.
Okay. And we earlier talked about your new challenge, that is equity strategic solutions. So, how can a listener connect with you or learn more about your work at Equity Strategic Solutions?
Okay, well, before we end, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a fascinating conversation that I've enjoyed very much, Ash. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Um, I am so Acuity Strategic Solutions. I'm more than happy to connect with listeners with any workplace issue that they'd like to discuss, whether it's for advice, to set up training, working with your bargaining team, working with your board or your executive, and so on. Acuity's website is going to be up and running in the spring, so it's not quite there yet, just setting up the infrastructure right now. But in the interim, listeners can contact me through my LinkedIn profile or by phone at 416-200-3674.
Sounds good. And this is end of our podcast. So thank you so much for tuning in today's episode of Coffee with HR Pro. A huge thank you to Lisa for sharing her wealth of knowledge and experience with us, from the importance of arbitration to fostering collaboration in labor relations. Lisa provided so many valuable insights for all of us navigating the complexity of the workplace. If you would like to learn about Lisa's work, you can connect with her through her LinkedIn page. Uh, I will share in my podcast uh, thumbnail or in a chat somewhere. Um, I will be sure to include all her details of in this episode. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe or leave reviews and share it with your network. Let's keep the conversation on going. Until the next time, I am Ash, and this is Coffee with HR Pro. So stay curious, stay